Music is like all art, and it's up for interpretation. And I don't know what you hear when you hear the song Oceans, or what you think about, or what it means to you. There's definitely a part of the song that's talking about being in a bad spot, being in a place where the oceans are around and it's scary. And what I have to do is I have to make that decision. Am I going to turn to God in that moment, or am I going to be focused more on the ocean, more on the bad circumstances or whatever is around me than I am on God? Regardless of what generation you're a part of, no generation has ever lived in a godly culture. No generation has ever lived in a godly culture. Every culture, every empire, every country has always been godless and will always be godless until Jesus comes and sets up his ultimate reign. So if you're waiting for the culture to change, if you're waiting for a new president to make things better, you are going to be disappointed. Because no culture, no generation has ever lived in a godly culture. Today is September the 11th, 9/11. And if you're older than 20 years, if you're more than 15, 20 years old, you remember that day. In fact, for many of us, we can go back and remember what that was like on September 11th, 2001. You can go back and go through what your day was like. I remember getting in my green Honda Civic on that Tuesday morning and driving to work and hearing the FM DJ talking about a small plane that was flown into one of the World Trade Centers. About a half mile up the road, he interrupted a song and said, "That's not the correct information," and talked about the first plane. But I had a short drive to the church that I was working at the time, and by the time I get into the parking lot of the church, they were talking about the second plane. And I can go through and recount everything that happened in that day, as many of you can. It is a reminder that we live in a godless world. We always have, and we always will, until Jesus returns. Those planes flying into those buildings, a picture of what it looks like when God is not present. When a people turn their back on God. Every culture has always turned its back on God. Adam and Eve in the garden were the culture. They were everything. There was nothing but them. And what did they do? Created a godless culture. So waiting for the culture to change is not what we're called to do. What we're called to do is to be godly in a godless culture. And so how do we do that? How do I go about being godly in a godless culture? Well, there is a book in the Old Testament called Daniel, and it's written by Daniel. And Daniel is a major prophet. And just give you a little bit of review of how the Old Testament is set up. The Old Testament, actually the entire Bible, is set up by the kinds of literature that it is. So the first 5 books of the Bible is law. It's the books of the law. And then we get into history books where we learn about King David and King Saul and Solomon and all of that good stuff. And then we get into the wisdom books like Ecclesiastes and Jobs and Psalms and Proverbs and Songs of Solomon. And then we get into the major prophets. The major prophets are like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel. And then we get into the minor prophets. And the minor prophets are all those little books that are really kind of hard to say, or they're fun to say, like Habakkuk. It's just like a really fun book to say. Let's just read from Habakkuk. Now, a major prophet is a major prophet because of the length of the book. It's not that he was more important. It's not that Daniel was more important than Habakkuk. And it's not that God loved Daniel more than he did Habakkuk. It's just Habakkuk just didn't have a lot to say. And so he said it real quickly. And so it's a really short book. And then Daniel had a lot to say, and Isaiah would not shut up. And he just talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. And so that's like a major one, okay? So Daniel is this major prophet. Now, a prophet's job is to tell people what's going to happen If you follow God, this is going to happen. If you don't follow God, this is going to happen. And then some prophets actually would talk about what's going to happen in the future. But the stuff that was going to happen in the future was always a little bit fuzzy. It was just kind of like, if you keep doing that, something bad's going to happen. Well, that's helpful, but what's the bad? Well, I don't really know what the bad is, but that's what a prophet would do. So Daniel tells us his story. Now, Daniel, I just want to be honest with you. Daniel's a weird book. And anybody ever, if you've read the whole book of Daniel, raise your hand. Okay, so you know what I'm saying. If you haven't read the whole book of Daniel, you need to read it and you'll know what I'm saying. It's got some hippie in it. It's got some hippie stuff. I mean, it's got stuff talking about like being thrown in furnaces and not burning up and somebody else being in there. And then there's this one story about this hand writing on the wall, just a hand. I'm telling you, it's some hippie kind of stuff. And then you got Daniel going in and he's talking to angels and angels are coming. And there's and the other thing about Daniel, it jumps all over the place. There's not any really particular order to it. So what I want to do this morning is I want to give us 5 tools by looking at 5 words, 5 qualities that will help us, if we'll do them, live a godly life in a godless culture. And we're going to do that by looking at some of the stories in Daniel. Now, there's lots of stories in Daniel, but there's 3 really primary ones. There's a food test. There's a worship test involving a furnace. And there's a prayer test involving some lions. And so these are the major stories that are in the book of Daniel. And we're going to look at those this morning as we look at these qualities that we need. If you're taking notes, the first quality is this, is obedience. If I'm going to live a godly life in a godless culture, then I have to be obedient. Obedience is key. Now, obedience is not a fun book. I mean, it's not a fun word. It's not a fun book. Obedience book, not a fun book. There's nothing fun about obedience. Nobody ever walks around going, I love being obedient. No, there's something inside of you when somebody tells you what to do, even when you know it's right. You want to go, no. All of these kindergartners will do that today, multiple times, and you haven't grown out of it. When somebody tells you something, I'll show you. What are you talking about? That's what happens. Obedience is crucial. You cannot be a godly person if you're not obedient. And you have to be obedient to how God says to do it. So when God says do this and you don't do it, you're not being obedient. And when God says don't do that and you do it, you're not being obedient. You have to be obedient. And if we're not obedient, it doesn't matter. When you're not obedient, you're just a part of the godless culture. Obedience is critical. We have to be obedient. This is what Daniel says in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. This is the food test. And before I read that, let me just set it up. Daniel's been minding his own business with his buddies. They're at home. Babylon comes in. King Nebuchadnezzar comes in, destroys the country, takes them back, sets them into the king's court. And they're going to train them. They're going to go to school. They're going to learn literature and wisdom and philosophy and all of that kind of stuff, astronomy. And then they're going to get to eat from the king's table. And so this is what happens. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to him by the king. Now, Daniel's a Jewish boy. And he's been told there are certain things you can eat and there are certain things you cannot eat. And so Daniel is in the king's palace and he's looking at the buffet. Fried catfish, lobster, bacon. It smells great. But he's looking at all of this stuff. And he's going, I can't eat it. I've been told I'm not supposed to eat it. And so this is what he does. He asks the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now that takes some courage and some bravery to go up and say, hey. The guy's scared of the king. He's saying, no. Can't do that. He says, listen, 10 days, let us eat vegetables and drink water for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, compare us, see who looks better. Well, they win. They look better. Daniel was obedient. He was obedient in a place where it was very hard to be obedient. When you have to go to the king, who at the snap of the finger can have your head cut off, and say, I don't like your wife's cooking. This is not a smart thing to do. I can't eat your meals. I can't eat what you enjoy. I can't eat what you like. To do that takes an incredible amount of obedience. Now, here's a key thing in this obedience thing, because with obedience comes pain. Suffering can lead to obedience. Suffering can lead to obedience. I'm going to remind you of some things about Daniel. Maybe tell you some things about Daniel you don't know. Daniel, at this point, it's just verse 8. This is just chapter 1, verse 8, right at the beginning of the story. Daniel has already been through an enormous amount of suffering. He's been ripped out of his home. He's been taken to a foreign country. He's been made into a slave, and almost for certain is a eunuch by this time. David has been through an enormous amount of suffering. And yet he is still what? He's been through an enormous amount of suffering, and he is still obedient. See, when suffering hits you, you have one or two choices. When the ocean hits, when the waves hit, and when the waves up to your eyeballs, you have two choices. You obey God, or you cuss God. That's what you do. You do one of those. There is no middle ground. Obedience. And sometimes it takes the suffering for us to be obedient. This is what Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7 and 8 says. While Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence of God. Even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. Suffering can lead to obedience, which has led me to this prayer that I have prayed since I was a teenager. And this is the prayer. Father, may I choose to obey you without you having to get my attention. God, I want to be obedient to you. And I don't want you to have to drag me through the pain for me to be obedient. I don't want to have to do that. I grew up in church. I'm a church boy. I went to church 18 times a week. I've heard all kinds of testimonies. And when I was young, I would hear these guys get up and I'd hear these women get up and they'd give these awful, awful testimonies. They were going through all of this junk and words I can't say in church. They just went through all this stuff. And then they would say, and then I started listening to Jesus. Now, I said, what would happen if you listened to Jesus first? So I have a really, really, really boring testimony. Doesn't involve a lot of pain, suffering. And I think part of it because I've prayed this prayer. Father, I want to be obedient to you without you having to get my attention. Now, is there pain and suffering in my life? Absolutely. And does that generally point me to obedience? Yes. But I have to be obedient. I cannot live a godly life in a godless culture if I'm not obedient. The second one is this, perspective. Perspective. Daniel chapter 1, verse 2, right at the beginning of Daniel telling us his story. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim, him being King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king of Judah, and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of God. At the very beginning of Daniel's story, Daniel's letting the people who's reading this, he's letting his fellow Jewish people know, listen, the reason that I'm in Babylon is because God has me in Babylon. The reason that King Nebuchadnezzar could come in and destroy our country and take our holy relics out of the temple is because God let him. Daniel is stating this up front. Daniel did not dig himself into some giant emotional hole where he's walking around going, why God, why God, why God? No. Daniel had the perspective. Daniel knew what was happening. Daniel knew that God was God. Without perspective, everything gets blown out of proportion. When I don't have the proper perspective, everything gets blown out of proportion. It's just so easy to make a mountain out of a molehill. I take something that doesn't matter and I make it matter because I don't have the proper perspective. Without perspective, everything gets out of proportion. Perspective allows me to see the bigger picture. Perspective allows me to see the bigger picture. Daniel knew there was a bigger picture going here. Daniel knew something else was going on here. This just wasn't his suffering. This just wasn't him being in a particular situation. He's going like, I'm going to pull back and I'm going to see the big picture here. Now, sometimes in life we need real detailed things, but a lot of times in life we need a 30,000-foot view. And we need to be able to step back and say, does this matter? Because when I don't have the right perspective, my stress and my worry go through the roof. I'm worried and stressed out about stuff that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You just start making a list of the things that stress you out. And then 2 weeks later, go back to that list. This is one of the things that bugs me about. I love sports. I try to use not all my illustrations to be sports, but I fail. I love sports. And I love all these guys who give all their predictions and they talk about the games each week. I just wish they would go. I wish they have a segment. I was wrong. Like they would go back and they would go like watch all the things that they said the previous week where they were wrong on 95% of it. So often, we're just wrong because we don't have the right perspective. And we've got to get that. Perspective allows me to see the bigger picture. I love the parade illustration. You can see at a parade, you can see the float right in front of you. And maybe you can see one or two in front of that and one or two after that. Well, what does God see? He sees the whole parade. He sees the whole thing. We got to practice that. God sees the whole parade. Now, I can't see the whole parade. I don't have the ability to see the whole parade. But being godly means what? Acting and thinking like God. You know this? Being godly means to act and think like God. God has a big picture view. God doesn't have a teeny little thought. That's not the way he thinks. I got to have better perspective because we just overreact to so many things. So that means we need to practice perspective checks. And I know you've heard of reality checks, but we need to practice perspective checks. We need to just stop and ask, does this matter? John sent me a picture yesterday of went to this soccer game. Colton and Braden are playing soccer, and I feel sorry for him. He's entering into that point of life. And but he says this picture of this sandwich sign. Number 1, they are kids. Had the logo of the soccer league and all that. Number 1, they are kids. Number 2, it's a game. Number 3, the coaches are volunteers. Number 4, the referees are human. Number 5, this is not the World Cup. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Why do they put that there? Because you don't have any perspective. And when you're the dad, you lose perspective. You actually think the score of 3-year-old soccer game matters. It doesn't. Who won the last World Cup? Real quick. See? That's my point. And that's where it matters. We got to have perspective. We've got to have perspective. So stop. Let's have some perspective checks. Before you get all bothered about something, pull back and say, what's a 30,000-foot view? I don't want to stand up here every week and tell you why we're moving to Pinecrest. I just want to say, it's better. Let's go. The building's better. It's just better. For what we're doing is better. Let's go. Perspective. So I got to be obedient. Remember, if I'm waiting for the culture to become godly, I'm going to be really disappointed. What God's called me to do is to be godly in a godless culture. So I've got to be obedient. I got to be perspective. Then I got to have endurance. Daniel had endurance. Daniel chapter 6, verse 28. This is the end of the Daniel and Lion's Den story. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now, the food test that's in chapter 1 is under King Nebuchadnezzar. The Daniel and Lion's Den test is under King Darius. Tells us later that there is a king of Persia. And then there's another king in about chapter 5 or so. That's the whole writing on the wall thing. You don't want to be that king. He died that night. 4 kings that we know of, Daniel served under. Now here I want you to get the rhythm of Daniel's life. Ripped out of his home, into Babylon, made into a eunuch. He interprets a dream for King Nebuchadnezzar. And then King Nebuchadnezzar appoints him to a high place in the kingdom. And then King Nebuchadnezzar goes away. And a new king comes in. And Daniel keeps his position? No. Daniel goes back down. Because when the new king has a problem, they start asking around and looking for somebody to solve it. And then Daniel's brought up. Daniel solves it. He gets a new position. And then a new king comes in. What happens to Daniel? He goes back down to being a slave. They need him. He gets back into the palace. Palace, slave quarters, palace, slave quarters, palace, slave quarters, palace, slave quarters. It takes an enormous amount of endurance to do that. Living a godly life is really hard. Really hard. And it takes an enormous amount of endurance. And what does endurance mean? It means not quitting. That's what endurance means. Not quitting. Not only, endurance. That's how Larry Osborne says it. Endurance reaps great rewards, but it's no fun getting there. A couple of years ago, I signed up for a gym that's just right down the street from where I live. And so this is great. I can run down there and work out and run back. And first day I did that. It's great. I ran down, literally down. It was all downhill. Worked out. And then for I guess I had a rocky moment. You know, sometimes you get the rocky moment. You think you're going to. And so I'll run back, but I'll run back the long way. Uphill. All the way uphill. I thought I was going to die. I was like, I did not remember this street being this long. I mean, where's the red light? They have moved the red light. I know they have moved an entire intersection because I could never get there. Now, that was a couple of years ago. This past February, I started running. My doctor told me to start running. And so I started running. And the first time I went running, oh my gosh. Why would anybody run if nobody's chasing you? I don't understand. This is hard. This is hard. But I run. And I've been running. And I've been running. So since February until the end of August, I've just been running even in the hot time of year. I just run. We signed up for that same gym again so our whole family can go. And so last week, I'm gonna run to the gym. So I run to the gym, downhill, no problem. Actually, I ran downhill the long way. And then coming back, I ran back the long way. And I got to my house, said, that was easy. I can't believe that used to be hard. Because now it's not hard at all. Because my endurance is better. Now, we get that physically. But it's also true spiritually and emotionally and mentally. I have to have the endurance. If I'm going to live in a godless place, in a godly way, I got to be obedient. I got to have the right perspective. I got to have endurance. And then I got to have confidence. I got to have confidence. My favorite 2 verses in all of the Bible is in Daniel chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 3 of Daniel's buddies. And King Nebuchadnezzar comes in and says, I'm going to build this statue, and when I ring the bell or sound the horns or whatever, everybody has to worship me. So they ring the bell, and everybody worships except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they're taken for the punishment. The punishment is if you don't do this, you get thrown into a fiery furnace. You get burned alive. That's what verse 17 of chapter 3 says. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, and I believe that's their way of saying, listen, king, you could change your mind. That if we're thrown in there, we don't have to go in there. But if you throw us in there, the God whom we serve is able to save us. And that's huge. The God we serve is, they did not say will. They said the God we serve is. They did not say will. He goes on to say, He will rescue us from your power. You know what they're saying? Either way, we're good. Either way, we're good. Don't throw us in, we're good. Throw us in, we're good. If He saves us when you throw us in, we're good. If it burns us up, we're good. We're good. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. I love verse 18. But even if He doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. But even if He doesn't, see, if you're going to live in a godless culture, you got to get to the point where you can say that. You can have to get to say, my confidence in my God is so strong. My confidence in my God is so real that even if He doesn't rescue me the way that I want Him to rescue me, I will not bow to your ways. I will not do it. That's confidence. And you cannot live in a godless culture in a godly manner and not have confidence. And if you need the crowd to give you confidence, you're in trouble. Because the crowd is always wrong. Some confidence builders real quick. Remember, God is God. Remember, God is God. That's the ultimate reality check and perspective check. God is God. When I can live in such a way that God is God, then I don't have to worry about stuff. I don't have to worry about the problems. I don't even have to worry if you're a problem. Because God's God. God's got it. Don't take myself too seriously. You show me somebody who laughs at themselves, and I'll show you a confident person. Show me someone who can laugh at themselves, and I'll show you a confident person. Don't take yourself so seriously. Learn how to laugh. Learn how to make fun of yourself. Listen to what healthy people say about me. Highlights, star, circle, bold, whatever you need to do, healthy people. Because there's going to be a lot of unhealthy people in your life that are going to say stuff to you that's not true. Listen to what healthy people have to say about you. Trust what I know, not what I feel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing before that furnace, they felt afraid. They felt scared. But they reacted and did based on what they knew, not what they felt. And then the last one is help others. Help others. And we know we're supposed to help others. We know we want to be giving people. We know we want to help people. I'm going to tell you the primary reason you need to help other people is because when you help other people, you'll have friends. When you help other people, you're going to have friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Don't you love that it's a story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? It's not just a story of Shadrach. They were standing there together. Now, they were outnumbered, but they were together. I got to be obedient. I got to have the right perspective. I got to have endurance, and I got to have confidence. And the last one I got to have is courage. Courage. Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. But when Daniel learned what the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to God. And he did that fully knowing that the lion's den was next. And that takes courage. That takes courage. Courage is different from bravery. I'm not saying be brave. I'm saying having courage. The Latin word for courage means this: to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. Don't let action movies define your definition. Don't let action movies give you your definition for the word courage. Because what courage really means is telling your story with all of your heart. How did Daniel tell his story with all of his heart? I'm here in this God-forsaken place because God has me here. I'm going to pray like I've always prayed because my God is my God. Your Majesty, even if he doesn't, we will not bow. If I'm going to live in a godless culture, in a godly manner, I've got to have obedience. I've got to have perspective. And I've got to have endurance. And I've got to have confidence. And I've got to have courage. Now, let me tell you why you can have those 5 things. I'm going to tell you why you can have those 5 things and why I can have those 5 things. Because Jesus has already done that for us. Jesus was completely and totally obedient. Jesus always had the right perspective. Jesus endured everything. Jesus was confident. And would you ever doubt his courage? And the reason that I can live those things and the reason I can have those things is because Jesus has already done it for me. And now he's just asking, Marty, are you willing to let me do it with you? Please don't wait for the culture to change. The good old days have never been the good old days. We just forget. Don't wait for the culture to change. God's asked you to change. And he's asked me to change. And he's given us the power to do it if we'll let him.